Okay, I've just cloned the latest version of Cypher GUI. Sorry, the latest version of CodeCrack, which contains the cyphergui.py file. And this is a continuation of the code review. A couple of small things. First is I want to repeat myself by saying that 90% of programming is testing. Another 5% is probably just the naming conventions. The naming conventions are not that important, but they can help. Not as much as testing, but it can help a lot to clarify what the code is doing. So when I discussed removing these widgets from globals, removing them from the global scope and packing them into an object by defining a class, the class name that I gave was Cypher GUI, Cypher Application. The reason for that is I wanted it to be very clear to myself later on, simply by looking at the beginning of the program, what type of application I've written. App is simply an abbreviation, a shortcut that doesn't return any benefits in the name. You could name every Kinter application. You can derive a new class from the TK class and name it app if you want to. However, it's really, especially in the desktop world, it's really an application, and there's no advantage in saving 7 or 8 letters in the name. In fact, there's a distinct disadvantage. The first problem is that I don't know what type of, and doing the mental translation of app to application, I don't know what type of application this is. And however, if this were better named, i.e. Cypher Application, then I would know exactly what this application is doing without having to take the mental exercise of reading through the code. Another thing is that I would prefer the more generic app to be used, to leave that available as something that would be more reusable. So we have a choice. We can name this something generic as app, or we could name it something specific as in Cypher Application. If it's Cypher Application specifically, then we know that we're probably not going to be reusing this class for something else. However, if it's a custom class like app, or something generic like label or window, that sort of subtly implies that this class can be reused in another situation. However, this particular class, because it is a GUI application with a lot of hard-coded defined widgets in it, there's just no way to reuse this. And so this name needs to be a dead-end name, Cypher Application, as opposed to an open-ended name, app, a more generic name, which implies that it can be reused. So this needs to change. Now, other problems with the code are that here, well, let's go down. So here, okay, first, aside, blank line at the end of the file. So I don't have to read the text just barely above the top of the screen. I can actually get some white space underneath it. This is much easier to read because there's an extra line at the bottom. Non-consequential, but it's just nicer. So here we're creating an app. And again, because it's an app, just looking at the bottom of the file, we don't know, and we don't necessarily have to know. We're not telling ourselves what type of application we're running. But it would be convenient for us later on, or for someone looking at this the first time, if they could tell from these last three lines exactly what type of application we're instantiating and running. So this is, aside from, okay, which leads to another problem, are these function definitions in here? Are these method definitions inside of this class? So app here is a global. And prior to this code being commented out, this global was being referenced inside of a method definition in a class, which is a poor programming practice. So uncomment it out. Now, another question, a more religious question, which doesn't have a good answer, is if this visioneer function and this Caesar function, if those two functions, should they be members of the app class? Now, here's where things get weird, because here we're using a generic term for app, but here we've hard-coded the cipher methods inside of this generic app container. So we're being very specific and explicit in the functionality of this application class, but then we've given it a generic name, which is sort of a contradiction. And in actuality, we would really like this class to be, well, not concerning the class, but this functionality here should not be embedded in the class, because this code right here, we would want this code to be reusable. We would want to be able to use this code in a GUI application as it is here, and also in a command line interface program. But if we embed this inside this class, then we're going to have to dig into the class. We'd actually always have to instantiate, well, would we or wouldn't we? I'm not sure about how Python handles these class methods. But no, I'm pretty sure this is not going to be generic, because you've got to pass self, which means this class can only be referenced through an app instance. So we want to pull these two methods out. We don't use self inside of those methods, so we can just take this out and take this out, and then wherever we're calling cipher, Caesar cipher, we don't want to do it through, and here's another thing. Okay, so here is the main GUI function that bridges the gap between the GUI, the presentation elements, and the logic. This sets up everything. This pulls the data from the input boxes, the check boxes, and should do the appropriate validation and error checking. And then finally it calls one of the two cipher methods. So this is the bridge. But this method here is inside of is a method on the app class, and it explicitly has a self pointer. So this method should also not be reaching out into the global namespace. This call, if it was a correct call, this should be a self pointer. But since I pulled the function out of the class definition anyway, it doesn't need any sort of pointer or reference, especially not a global reference, to execute the code. However, let's see, dot. So this code can just get deleted. This code can just be deleted. Okay. So here again, we're calling the display results function, which is a method inside the app class. So this call should be done through a self pointer and not a reference into the global namespace. And I think that's it. Yes. So we're creating an app. We're creating an instance of the app class, which is a TK class, and then we're running its main loop, and this is all fine. And this is the only place we should be referencing app dot. There should be no app dots embedded in the class method. That's what the self pointer is for. Okay, so that's that. So that's going to be the end of this session. And what we don't want and other improvements that we can make. Okay, we need better names here, and then throughout the code we need better testing, and I'm going to discuss some of that in the next session.